Welcome back, wall crawlers, to the Mediocre Spider-Mat. On today's epic episode, we're going to be doing something that everyone dreads, something that causes sweat to drip from the brow and the butthole to tighten. Today, we are doing something different! Haha, horrible, isn't it? Don't worry, we'll be back with regular reviews of Spidey titles next time. Today though, let's whip out our cameras and hunt down the Spider-Man projects that were not long for this world. Games that for a variety of reasons, mostly Activision stupidity, were either shot in the street or had their necks snapped well before their time. So load up your web shooters, slip on your red booties, and let's take a snapshot of Spider-Man's greatest unmade adventures. Our hero's harrowing tale begins! Let's start off in the greatest decade of all, the 1990s. Sega of America were seeing their 16-bit market share explode thanks in part to the efforts of a certain blue gerbil, but also a variety of key third-party titles like Mortal Kombat and John Madden Football. Not to be outdone was the simply named Spider-Man for the mighty Sega Genesis. This was actually quite the smash hit, as it was the first video game that really did the character justice. Yeah, the Atari version and the skeleton version didn't really cut it. This Genesis one, though, included the majority of the Sinister Six, Kingpin of course, but also featured Venom in, I believe, his video game debut. Well, he was quite a hot character at the time. The Sega CD edition, released later, made some improvements, such as an extra level and Oscar-worthy cutscenes.
You just relax, Sparky, and don't blow a fuse. There'll be someone along to cut you loose any time now.
Why don't you relax, Spider-Man? Take some time off!
But with the Genesis version being by far the biggest seller, it's no surprise that a follow-up was being considered. I spoke to Ed Annunziata, the creator of Echo the Dolphin and a producer at Sega of America, who said that a Spidey sequel was going forward, if not for a certain X Factor. He wanted to pitch another Spider-Man vs. Kingpin title exclusively on the Genesis, one where the masked menace would have to defuse numerous bombs which Wilson Fisk had laid all over the city. As it turns out, his bosses at Sega of America handed him the X-Men license instead. See, the Children of the Atom were the it thing at the time, due to the sales of X-Men #1, as well as the Fox Kids cartoon which had just premiered. So Spidey was cast aside for the flavor of the month, which in hindsight was probably the right move. X-Men for the Genesis was another massive hit and led to the fan-favorite sequel, Clone Wars, which then kicked off a whole other legacy of X-branded games, and really, the rest is history. But it is funny, at one point, the web-slinger was being positioned as a character that Sega wanted to represent their brand, like Michael Jackson. Hell, they both even had their own Sega-made arcade games. How about that shit? Damn, it really would have been interesting to live in the timeline where it was Spider-Man who got the early 90s video game shine instead of the filthy muties. I mean, gifted youngsters. Next up is the only recently uncovered Ultimate Spider-Man 2, a sequel to, well, Ultimate Spider-Man. In the interim between the second and third Sam Raimi movies, there was a smaller team within Treyarch that put out a fun, low-key game based on the Ultimate continuity. This was a big departure from the movie-based versions, as it had its own storyline, a much smaller section of NYC to swing through, and 2 playable characters. The game was warmly received by critics and fans for its vibrant visuals, comic-like aesthetics, and gameplay variety. Once it was released, the team at Treyarch started concepting and prototyping several pitches for their next title, and one of them was Ultimate 2. Brian Michael Bendis was going to return to pen a story that would revolve around the Green Goblin. The playable area was set to expand with additional boroughs, including Brooklyn and Coney Island.
Hey yo, Ariana Grande, what's up, mama? I'll come to Coney Island, take a spin on a cyclone. I miss you.
According to lead texture artist Chris Salazar, the game would take place during the winter and featured a snow-covered version of the Big Apple, much like how it was done in 2020's Miles Morales. Salazar had made several assets for the game, but it ultimately didn't make it very far into development, with only this art by Ian Hosfield surviving. It's been theorized that Green Goblin would have been the second playable character in lieu of Venom, and while this makes sense, it's never really been confirmed. When I spoke to Chris, he said that while it certainly wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility, he also wasn't sure if that was going to be the final plan. He did confirm that the Emerald Elf was indeed at least going to be the central villain. Brian Michael Bendis reportedly then decided to reuse said story treatment for the actual Death of the Goblin comic arc, so it at least wasn't a total wash. I would have reached out to Mr. Bendis myself to confirm, but I'm just a lowly, mediocre Spider-Man. As for why it was cancelled, well, for the reasons you'd expect. Ultimate Spider-Man didn't sell nearly as much as Spider-Man 2, I mean, how could it? And Activision had little confidence in a sequel as a result. When dev ends and the product ships, teams are often in a holding pattern as the powers that be determine the next course of action. We were working under an assumption, which you know how that story goes. I would guess that Activision never wanted to invest in promotion to the extent it would need, hence the soft sales on Ultimate Spider-Man. There's a funny chicken and egg situation where the company is trying to forecast sales to determine how much to spend on promo, but if you don't spend on promo, you don't get sales, so I got the impression that Activision didn't have strong, long-term plans in those days. When USM2 was cancelled, they kept the team, but it wasn't certain what we'd do next. We spent a couple of months making Battleworld on our own until potential new games came up. One of those new games was 007 Quantum of Solace, which a good portion of the Ultimate Spider-Man team switched over to, and wait, hold up, what is Battleworld? Yes, we prototyped a Marvel game where you played with a series of characters on Battleworld, third person. We drew up rosters, I think it was 5 characters per, like several X-Men, etc. We didn't build too much, just a rudimentary landscape and sky, did visual research, was planning on basing the style on David Finch instead of Bagley, as we'd be moving to the PS3. Did a logo, and that was about it. Walloping web snappers, Chris. I had no idea that was a thing, or, well, it wasn't a thing, you know what I mean. Thanks again for the insight. The web of shadows unravels. If you're sad about that cancellation, well, save those tears, because you're gonna need them for our next scintillating saga. Web of Shadows, despite its various flaws with story, voice acting, and mission variety, was simultaneously lauded for its expansive and deep combat system that saw you taking the fight from the ground and into the sky with 2 distinct suit styles, one in the red and blue and one in the white and black. Web of Shadows showed a lot of promise in where it could go from there, and its developer, Shaba Games, was intent on doing just that. Enter Spider-Man Classic and/or Spider-Man Chronicles, the other name it was known by, which was designed from the very start to be a different beast from its open-world predecessor. Shaba wanted to focus on its combat system and to trim all the fat, namely the largely empty, lifeless open world. They would instead pivot into a level-based affair, with each mission revolving around a specific villain, with many of them being green or based on animals or both. The idea here was for this to be the greatest hits of Spidey's villain-punching career, tearing through each baddie with an expanded arsenal of moves and attacks. There was one other big twist though: the wall crawler wouldn't be doing it alone. Shaba wanted to let players also take control of Wolverine, using the same model from the first Web of Shadows, and let the duo take on criminals in 2-on-1 handicap matches? I'm not sure. These concept art pieces are the only images we have of the game, and it's not entirely clear how this marvelous team-up would have played out. Was it split screen with one player controlling Peter and the other Logan? Did it have online play? Would a single player swap between the two on the fly, like going between both suits in the last game? Or maybe you just fought each villain with a predetermined hero, which for my money was probably the most likely approach, but I guess we'll never truly know. This is because Shaba Games was closed down and the project cancelled before ever even being officially announced in mid-2009, and the concept of Spider-Man's greatest hits, which I'm sure Activision producers still had locked up in their mind prisons, moved over to Beanox, where it morphed into Shattered Dimensions. Do recall that this saw you fighting an extensive lineup of classic villains one after the other, all while using multiple characters. While I think Shattered Dimensions was absolutely the right game at the right time and would go on to inspire the entire concept of the Spider-Verse, which I'll forever be thankful for, a Webhead and Knucklehead team-up game would have also been really neat as well. Run! The Raimiverse is collapsing! The climax to our episode today concludes with Spider-Man 4, the unmade game based on the equally unmade movie. Well, not equally, actually, as the movie, funnily enough, is even more unmade. The story goes that Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire were still hankering for more back-breaking movie making, but Sam wanted some guarantees before he would sign on the dotted line. Sony Pictures didn't really have much in the way of big hits back then, or even now, and really wanted to get more radioactive spider blood on movie theater screens ASAP. Sam wanted more time to prep, to hone the story, to polish the script, and be given more than enough time to actually film it. Sony, however, wanted to fast-track it, just like Spider-Man 3, and well, the whole thing fell apart. Fell apart just like the very idea that Peter's parents could somehow be super advanced robo-androids that for several years of being amongst family and friends actually passed as fucking human beings. With Sam gone, the rest of the cast went with him. Oh no, Kirsten Dunst, no, please come back. So Sony felt it best at that point to just reboot the motherfucker. But the merchandising cycle had already begun far ahead of the movie. Not sure if any of you have noticed, but all Spider games based on the films were essentially their own thing, with 75% of them being composed of random villains and storylines, with only a couple of key bosses and cutscenes being slotted into that last 25%. The same held true for Spider-Man 4. Radical Entertainment of Hulk Ultimate Destruction and Prototype fame were given this Herculean task. Well, it wasn't too Herculean actually. Radical just used their already detailed model of NYC that they had used for the first prototype and swapped out Alex Mercer for Peter Parker. You can see in this footage, which was released online in 2021, link in the description, shared even more similarities with Prototype, like the UI and aerial helicopter battles. The game didn't get too far into development though, because when the movie collapsed, so did the game. The small advancements they did make were instead carried over to Prototype 2, which, like so many other stories I've covered before, led to Activision screwing over the studio in the end. More on that in this video here. That's not all. The wondrous waggling machine that is the Wii was also set to get a similar but completely different version of Spider-Man 4, developed by my precious, dear departed Eurocom. It was built from the ground up, and even in this early version seen here, had plenty of potential. It again was going to be developed in a similar style, populate the game with all kinds of missions and random villains, and then drop in movie-specific characters and storylines later on. Much like its HD counterpart though, once the movie went poof, so did Eurocom's work. Only 2 years later, Activision would then screw them over with the disastrous release of 007 Legends. You can find out in this video right here. Oh man, was this a fun episode or what? And there you have it, all the cancelled Spider-Man games I was able to get the scoop on. Technically, there was also the HDER ports of the first two Beanox games, but I covered them pretty well in my Edge of Time review. Nowadays, Spider-Man is treated like the absolute Chad King that he is, a character Marvel protects like he shoots golden spiderwebs straight out of his ass and into their bank accounts. Far gone are the days of letting publishers just slap him into any old thing just to make a quick buck, because they wouldn't do that anymore. I mean, he's too valuable and precious and god damn it. Hey, if you want to shout out some other Spider games you'd like me to cover in the future, let me know in the comments below, or head on over to the offices of the Daily Patribugle and become a big Jonah boss and nominate what I web up next. Until then, Excelsior, true believers, and I'll see you next time on the Mediocre Spider Mat.